Good evening, and welcome to another episode of the Perceptive podcast here on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. I am Josh Bycer, and for tonight's cast, this is going to be a follow-up with my discussion with Alchonos. This was a company that specializes in localizing games and trailers into different languages. Last time I spoke with Natalia, who focused on trailers and promoting games along those lines. Tonight, we have another person from the company here. This time we're going to be talking about game localization. Some of the challenges that go in it, especially if you're going from a language and culture that you may not really recognize as a developer or do too much research on. So, please welcome Localization Manager from Alchonos, Yana. How are you doing?
Doing great today, Josh. Thanks. Great to be here with you.
Yeah, it is great to have you on. I'm happy we got a chance to do this cast. I'm sure, again, like after my first cast with Natalia about kind of the services Alchonos did from a trailer standpoint, talking more about some of the details of localization is a topic that, for a lot of developers out there, I'm sure for people that you and Alchonos have worked with, it's probably something that they don't really consider when they're in the middle of game development.
Sure. Now, as the international market continues to grow, with our services being more and more popular, and with the developers thinking about which markets to choose for the localization first and which to go next with. So it is really important to talk about localization more. And I think for developers, it is really useful to understand what localization process consists of.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of, I guess, as a quick introduction, could you talk a little bit about what your role as a localization manager entails at Alconost?
Well, a localization manager is in charge of your project. If you're, as a developer, come to Alconost for localization, a manager is your contact point who will be connecting you to the translators, to the proofreaders, to the linguists in general, and who will be also managing the technical side of the localization. So setting up your project on the localization platform, also setting up all the necessary things like the glossary and the translation memories. I think we will talk about that later.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a person responsible for taking in the strings for localization, your game, and then returning you the results in the languages of your choice in the same form as you've given the source. So the results are given in the form that you would prefer. So this is who the manager is, and this is a person who rules all the localization process, and I think I will dwell on it in more detail later.
All right. So I guess the first question then, when a developer, I guess, reaches out to Alchonos, what exactly does localization mean, like in your specific department? Because again, when I did my cast with Natalia, we focus more on the idea of game trailers, marketing your game in different languages, that kind of thing. So when somebody works with you, what exactly or what services do you provide to them?
So our sources is our translators and our proofreaders, our linguists. It is also the processes of the localization and of the quality control that we manage, and also the localization platform and the way we use it to provide the highest quality possible. So I think it is really hard to establish on your own as a developer without a proper translator base and without proper staff base. This is our main asset. It is our linguists.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I guess my next question then is, when a developer reaches out to Alchonos, what is kind of the process? Like, how do you start working with someone when it comes to localizing their game for different languages?
So usually developers come to us with the quote request. This is actually the first question that we're dealing with. Everybody is concerned about the budget of the localization. It is very understandable. We assess the amount of text in the game, and we provide a quote for every language of the developer's choice. So we provide a relatively specific budget for every language. I say relatively because sometimes some budget can be added, some budget can be reduced by some means in the future in the process of localization. But first we assess the amount, the budget, and the amount of time as well that we will spend on localizing the product.
Mm-hmm. So I guess here's a question that I'm sure developers are wondering. Is there a different cost? Like, do you have like different costs based on what languages that you're translating into? Like, completely divorced from like the word count that would go into a game or the amount of things that have to be translated?
Yes, sure.
Mm-hmm.
The costs differ for different language groups, and it usually depends on the popularity of this or that language on the market. We actually have like three language groups with different costs, different rates. So we have the most popular languages, which are the common European languages like Italian, Spanish, French, German, which come in one group of rates. Then we have less common languages. There are less translators who specialize in these languages. So that is why they have a bit higher rates. And then we have the languages with the highest rates. It's usually the Scandinavian languages and Japanese. So this is the group of highest rates. So when you choose from which languages to start localization of your game, you need to consider the market you're coming to, whether it is the most popular market with the lowest rates for localization.
Mm-hmm. So when developers reach out to Alchonos about this specific topic, again, for people listening, when I spoke with Talia, we were focusing more on the marketing and kind of building trailers side of things. But when it comes to actually localizing your game, this is actually changing, the text and how things look into it. For this specific point, when should developers like reach out? When should they start considering localizing their game along this line?
I would say that for console games, localization process is usually planned before the release.
Mm-hmm.
So developers usually know which markets they are planning to come to. So they develop a game in some international language, or sometimes it could be the native language, and then they require translation into, for example, English, and then translation from English into some other languages. So this can be also the case. But usually this is done before the first release of the game. So usually we start several months at least, and maybe half a year before the release. So this is for those who are most considerable, I guess, just because localization may require, actually requires always lots of testing on the side of the linguists and on the side of the developers. So that is why it is better to have more time to be prepared for any glitches and bugs that may come out.
Mm-hmm. And when you're trying to, I guess, get a game translator, get it localized, one aspect that we didn't really get to touch on the last cast is the point about doing this from a UI perspective. Obviously, for developers listening to us right now, that when you change the language of the game, you also change things such as how the text looks and how that relates to, any UI boxes or menuing in a title. When we're talking about things from this aspect, do you work with a developer in terms of how the text and how the translations will look, or localizations will look within the game space itself?
We have a specific kind of service for that, which is called localization testing.
Mm-hmm.
So this is actually the final, I guess, stage of the localization process when the localization and proofreading have been finished,
Mm-hmm.
and the strings are imported in the game, and then the developer can see how they look in the game. In the process of localization testing, we usually give the testers access to the test build of the game, and they then check all the screens one by one, all the strings that they have translated before,
Mm-hmm.
to see if they look right, if they're not too long, if they're not too short, if they fit the windows, and if they actually fit the context of the game, which is also important. and if they fit the images. This is all included in the localization testing process. And by the end of this process, they make a report where they list all the possible issues they've encountered, and we just fix them. And by the end of this process, the developer can be sure that nothing in the game looks not as it's intended.
Okay. Now, before we talk a little bit more about the actual processor, some of the interesting challenges that go into it, one thing that I was kind of curious about that we were talking about on our notes is the idea of the tools that you use. Now, for myself, and I'm sure for developers and students listening, we probably haven't done this before. So, like, for yourself and for the rest of your team at Alchonos, what do you actually use? Like, what kind of goes into this kind of localization process?
So it's also about the sources that we were talking about a bit earlier.
Mm-hmm.
One of the assets that we provide to our customers is the expertise of using localization platforms. We use different ones. Usually they are cloud platforms, which are made specifically for localization process. So they include all the features that help to make localization as seamless and as easy as possible. So our company is focused on using Cloudin, localization platform. We have built a strong relationship with this platform, and we use it for providing the highest quality and for building our quality assurance processes around it. But actually, any localization platform has more or less the same features. So the features are usually the ability to read the files the developers usually send us. So we translate different kinds of games. It can be mobile games in like strings format, for example, or in some other formats that can be read by some simple instruments, simple tools. So this is where the localization platform comes in, and it is really useful for breaking the code lines and extracting strings for localizations from them. Then the localization platform also features such important things as translation memory and glossary. Glossary is especially useful for games because in games, when you have some characters, when you have some specific items, it is very important for them to be called in the same way around the game. That is why making a glossary is actually one of the first stages of localization process. So after we have considered a quote with the developer and the developer agrees to the costs and to the deadlines and we start working on the project, we usually ask the customer to provide us with all the information they have about the project, about the game. We ask for screenshots, we ask for access to some test builds and things like that. And we always make a glossary which will include names of characters, names of items, maybe names of some specific actions that the characters do in the game, and so on. And then goes the translation memo, which is maybe a less common notion for developers and for those who are not engaged in translation and localization processes. So maybe I will need to explain a bit more about what translation memory is. So when we translate strings or text in a program on a localization platform, the translations get saved in a special database, which is called translation memory. So when next time the developer sends us the strings which are similar to those we translated before or which are just the same as we translated before, the translation memory suggests us the translations that we did for the strings last time. So this way, when there are lots of repeating strings in a game, which are used in different parts of the game, but they still repeat all the time, it is very good to use translation memory for consistency of the translations.
Mm-hmm.
You just see how you translated this specific string last time, and you use the same translation again. So the translation memory is also an asset which the developer can use after the localization process is finished. So even if our customers come to us with updates in 6 months or 12 months after they finished the initial localization of their game, we still have this translation memory and we still can see which strings were translated last time, what was the content and what glossary terms we had. So we can use all this information and not to start from scratch again. And also it is a great way to organize the team of localizers and the team of localization managers on both parts of the project, because there is localization manager on the side of localization company as Alchonost. And there is also somebody who is responsible for localization on the side of a developer, and to communicate with the translators and with the proofreaders. And the communication is very important. The localization platform is a perfect instrument. So the customer, the developer can usually see the whole process on this platform and can also add something to it. So to answer questions which arise about the context, about something during the process, and also can add screenshots, can add some background information. So this is a good place for everybody to connect and for the process to be more transparent.
And like we said a few minutes ago, with like the variety of games out there, that some games obviously take far longer to localize than others. I guess when it comes to, like, we're going to be talking a little bit more about kind of like the challenges from a cultural standpoint of localizing games in different languages in a few minutes. But from, like, if we're talking about things from a genre perspective, like, again, like something like an RPG or a game with a lot of text to it, are there any interesting or unique challenges that come up in specific genres that maybe a developer who is coming to work with Alchonos or one who's thinking about getting a game localized may not necessarily think about until it kind of hits them in the face?
Well, there are really differences and different problems, I would say, that arise for different kinds of games. For example, if we're talking about role playing, we know that there are lots of dialects in role playing games, and sometimes your next dialect string depends on which reply you chose before. So, this is an interaction of a player in the game. And it is very important to connect all the strings in a way that this dialect goes seamless. So I don't think that developers don't think about that, because when you develop a game, you anyway come across such challenges when you're writing the script. But when you're doing the localization, it is important to remember that that languages work in different ways. So, for example, in one language, it can be obvious of, for example, the gender of the character, if it is specified at all. And in other language, gender features can be erased just grammatically from grammatical point of view. For example, in English, it happens all the time. And when we're localizing from English into some other languages, it is very important to give the translators some notion of the gender of the character, if the character has any specific gender, if it is actually important in the game. So these are the things that are specific for different languages because of their different grammar, different word use. And that is why sometimes when we're localizing games, the questions that arise from the translators, they can be really surprising, like when they are asking whether like the character, they are like tall or short, because something will depend on that. Something in translation will depend on how they look, for example.
And I think that is a really good segue into this next question. And that is kind of going to more the finer points about localization, especially about making sure that the game reads, I guess, as much it makes sense in one language as it does another. Now, for people listening to us right now, when we're talking about localizing a game, it's not just simply translating text from, English to French, French to Japanese, Spanish, and so on and so forth. But for games that, especially those that have very strong characterizations and trying to tell a story like that, you also have to make sure that, how these characters are coming across makes sense across languages. And like I said a few minutes ago, like when it comes to role-playing games in particular, games that are built heavily on how characters are defined and how they speak to one another, this is certainly a major point. And I was hoping you could spend a few minutes talking about kind of making sure that characterization transfers from localization to localization?
That's a really great question because it is what the developers sometimes don't take into account, like the style of their characters and their specific characteristics. As you said, in like role playing, it can be really important. So the features of the character, the way they speak, the way they think, the way they interact with one another. And fortunately, we have an experience that allows us to predict such things. So, in cases when we see specific stylistic requirements to some specific characters in the narrative, for example, we had a game where we had a character who was talking like a pirate. He wasn't really a pirate, but he was using heavily the words from like pirate vocabulary, I would say, and some specific expressions and things like that. So we had to give the same impression in all the languages. And there were some languages where like the pirate theme wasn't really popular, as far as I remember, that there were some Asian languages involved. So the solution that we provide is to have several test localizations made. So we have several specialists each provide some short piece of text localized in their language, and then we assess the style, their ability to transfer this specific feature and the knowledge of this specific vocabulary. And we either make a choice on our own with the help of some maybe proofreader or some senior localizer, or we give the customer an opportunity to make a choice on their own if they have somebody who can read the language. Sometimes the developers prefer to have some like third-party expertise in these questions, so they can have like 3 test translations of some narrative piece, and they can look through them and they can choose the translator whose style is the best. So the quality is high anyway, but it is about the specific style that should be transferred. And this is the approach that I think is the best, I suppose, because the features of the character is what makes the game alive.
Definitely. And like we've seen from a lot of games that, and I think this is something that you mentioned at the start of our discussion, that making sure that your game can be played globally is becoming more and more important to development, especially when it comes to reaching a larger market. And one of the worst things I think you can do to a game in terms of this aspect is having, you know, a lot of your characterization lost in one specific language. Because, as I'm sure you're well aware, I'm sure the audience is, that there are major cultural differences around this world. So, you know, how you write a character in one language may not be how you want that to be exactly translated in another language.
Well, yes, that is true. The characters themselves, they change with the language, so they should be appropriate for the audience and they should be understandable for the audience to appreciate them. So that is why we can also ask the developers sometimes for some specific characteristics for each character in the game so that we have a grasp of what the characters are to convey. And sometimes we can provide some different approach to some characters. If we know that they won't be really accepted in some country, in some culture, we can provide some solution. We will discuss it with the developer first, with the customer. After the localizer suggests some options, we can just change some details which are important in one culture but which will not be accepted in another. So this is also the way that we can approach this problem. It can be difficult, of course, because we have the images, we have the key visuals, which sometimes are hard to change. So that is why, again, the localization testing is so important, because during the localization testing, localizers actually can see if what character says is too different from how it looks like, if it doesn't fit the character's looks in the game. So this is actually what we can also advise to maybe change a bit. So sometimes small alterations can be not important in the source language, but they can make the character fit for other broader markets.
Okay. And one thing that you said a second ago about like using images and information like that, that actually brings up an interesting question. For developers listening to us, when they reach out to a company like Alchonos, and they start looking into localizing their games, what information should they either send or prepare to send or build when they're reaching out to a company like Alchonos to get their game localized?
Well, it is always great to have the images of the main characters and the images of the items in the game, because there are so many kind of ambiguous words which may mean very different items in reality. So the characters and the items. As for the locations, this can be also an asset. So we usually try to collect every piece of information that the developer has about the game. It can be, well, descriptions, actually, not really images, but descriptions can also be useful, especially when it comes to the characters and the description of their personality or something like that. We actually provide quite a detailed localization brief with specific questions, and it is a good guide for the developers about what information we would need in the process. It includes the questions like what is happening in the game, like the screenshots of the characters, the gameplay and the whole. And it also includes some technical questions about what symbols can be used in the game or what we should or shouldn't translate. These are the questions that we ask before we start localization process. So this is a good way for the developer to understand what we need.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and it is, I think, a very interesting point about just like, again, like the amount of information that can be required to make localizations work along these lines. Now, one thing that you mentioned a few minutes ago, I think this will also be a good segue into another question from our notes, is about what localizers themselves, that was nice for me to say, who work or who get put onto the project. I'm sure, like, again, like, it's not just like one person who's going to localize a text for, an entire game all by themselves. In terms of like this part of the process, could you go into a little bit more detail about, like how many people will work on a game? Like, how does work get like divvied up or, separate into like different groups?
Well, yes, sometimes with mobile games, we can afford one person to translate and one person to proofread. This is what the basic localization process would include,
Mm-hmm.
the translation and the proofreading. But if the game is really big and has some specific sections that we can divide it into, for example, we have interface and narrative part and rewards part. We can divide the whole group of strings in some smaller groups in a reasonable way and have several translators who will work on the project. But it is very important to have one proofreader
Mm-hmm.
who will be consolidating the whole project and keeping the same style and keeping the same terminology across it, just to keep the style consistent at least. Of course, to speed up the process, we can distribute the strings between several translators. And for localization testing that I mentioned before, we can either invite the same proofreader who knows the context
Mm-hmm.
and who will just look for some technical problems and for some context problems when he knows or she knows this context. For example, the translation doesn't fit. And we can also invite a third party proofreader who will play the game, will look through the screens, yes, and have some fresh look at the whole localization and the whole game as it is,
Mm-hmm.
and will give some specific advice also on style. So this is also a possible solution. We can consider either option here.
Okay. And regarding kind of the context of localization, again, we mentioned this a few minutes ago regarding, making sure that the game makes as much sense in one language as it does to another. Any other aspects of that we didn't hit on that you'd like to bring up?
Well, I think we didn't talk about some specific cultural features
Mm-hmm.
which require real complex approach. I'm talking, for example, about holidays. Let's take this,
Mm-hmm.
like Halloween and Thanksgiving in the US, for example. Yes, and there are lots of updates, like holiday promotions. And it is very important to understand how to localize such things, which are not really something permanent.
Mm-hmm.
These are the features that are changing, but they need to be changed for each specific market. Just because we have different cultures across the world, as you said, and some events are more important for some groups of people than to others. So this is, I would say, a real art of localization, of keeping such things together when you have an update, and it should be localized in several languages for different groups of people with different backgrounds, and you do it in such a way to engage them anyway, whether they're interested in this or that cultural event or not. So this is, I think, what makes localization so fascinating, and why localizers are really thrilled sometimes about the process. And after they finish this process, when they manage to keep the attention of the players regardless of their cultural background.
Mm. And I would say that this will also be very challenging and very interesting to do for a lot of live service games, especially on the mobile space. As for like some of the games that I've played, I know some of the ones that are out there, they will typically have, festivals or events for, specific languages and cultures. Like I've seen games that will have, whatever the Chinese New Year is, that they'll have a specific event for that. While another game may have a, Halloween event, where you said a few minutes ago, a Thanksgiving event. And when you're trying to build a game globally like this, I'm sure it must be a very interesting challenge when you're trying to make sure that every culture you kind of have represented in your game has their respective, holidays and traditions in it.
Yes, that is exactly the challenge that we're tackling when doing the updates and doing with the specific cultural events in the games. And we don't just come across that during the updates, but sometimes the whole games can be built around some specific event which is important in one culture. And it is really important to explain why the event is important to players from other regions. So this is actually the approach that we use most. The explanation in translation, which is not really visible, which is so smooth that you don't really notice how you get engaged in another culture's event or in other culture's circumstances. So yes, this is a challenge, but this is actually why the localization is greater challenge than just a translation. As you said, it is not just about translating, but it's about transferring one culture into another, the game from one culture into another. And this, of course,
Mm-hmm.
has lots of aspects about it.
Mm-hmm. Now, another thing that we were talking about in our notes that it's not something that I really thought about, but I'm sure for localizers and for Alchonos, something that comes up is the idea of having people who are the native speaker who are doing the translating work. And I was wondering if you could go into a little bit more detail about, who should be, or like, what are the advantages and disadvantages of, who should be doing the localizing on a specific game.
Well, for Alconost, it is usually the native speaker who does the localization, because the native speakers are the best conveyors of cultural background, and they are people who live in the country where the game will be played, and they understand the immediate interests and everything that is happening in this country right now, and everything that is right and wrong for this specific country. So that is why
Mm-hmm.
we really usually work with the native speakers who live in the country of their language.
Okay. And when you're trying to, I guess, make everything work and make sure that everything gets translated properly, and again, like keep the characterizations, I guess, for developers listening, anything like specific, of course, not NDA breaking, of course, that comes up in terms of like a cultural difference or something that a developer may not necessarily think about in their own native language that need to be properly localized and maybe even change if you're going from one language to another.
Well, I would say that the thing that not so many developers think about, and not so many localizers even pay attention to it, not always, is, for example, colors.
Mm-hmm.
that are used to convey some positive or negative meaning, especially in games like when you fight someone. And when team fights a team, there can be some specific colors chosen to show that this is your team and this is your opponent's team. And it can be really different for different cultures. So you need to really change not only the text, of course, but we usually mention it to the customer and then give it to their consideration that for some specific regions the coloring should be different just because of the cultural specifics of this region. And of course, if they decide to implement some different colors, we change the text. If they decide to keep the colors and to make the game like neutral or decide to keep some colors internationally, we just leave the localization as is. So this is the things that we can advise on just because of our background and the knowledge of our linguists, but this will actually be the developer's decision if to change something in the visuals of the game or to keep them as is. So this is one example that comes to mind. So for the location, it can also be, so the visuals can also be a bit challenging. If, for example, you are building your game on the knowledge of some specific locations which are really famous around your region and you know that everybody knows them, it can be a bit difficult to understand for the players from other regions. So this is where we sometimes need to invent, where we need to explain a bit more and we need to add some more text, for example, just to convey this specific meaning of some location, of how it looks for the players to understand why it is important to anybody.
And like I know one big example, like for a lot of RPGs, is the color red and blue. That the color red in most games represents healing. Your health bar, runs out, it dies, while blue represents, your special abilities and things like that. And it is very challenging from a development standpoint that you have to keep track of these kinds of like affordances or standardizations that people come to expect. That again, like if you want to make a game and you make, let's say, the color yellow your health and the color green, your special abilities, that can throw a lot of people for a loop, even though that may be something that you're more recognizable for where you're at.
Well, when we're talking about things which are internationally established and which have some established habits across the players around the world, of course, they are usually very streamlined, and the localizers may even suggest to streamline such things. So if they think that it will be best for their audience. So why I said the localizers are our main asset, because they know what the target audience in the country of localization needs and what they are looking for and what they expect. So the expectations, to meet expectations is really important. So this is where I think we should keep to the expectations of the target audience.
All right. So let's talk a little bit more in detail about localization testing. This was something that we brought up earlier in the cast about, making sure that all the translations, all this fits within the game itself. Could you, I guess, expand a little bit more about what this process entails?
Sure. Usually, this process starts after the localization has been finished. So the translations are finished and they are transferred to the developers, and the developers implement them in the game. So we have games in different languages now available. For example, in the form of some test build, or we can have some special access to Steam, for example. We have special codes which we can use and go through all the levels of the game without like specific efforts. So this is the kind of work which is estimated in hours, and the localizers spend specific number of hours to check all the screens it is always best to have some scenario of what the localizer should do to check every screen available in the game. This is the perfect situation for us when the developer can provide us with some navigation through the game so that the localizers know which buttons to push to see every stream that they worked on. If we don't have this scenario like provided by the developer, we can build it ourselves. If the game is not that big, we can also make a list of strings which were localized, and the localizer, the tester, will go through the game and they will check every string that they have seen until there are no strings not checked in the game. If the developer doesn't have an opportunity to give us access to the game directly, we can also use the screenshots, especially when we're talking about some specific platforms where the game will be released. For example, for Switch, not all the localizers, not all the testers who worked on localization may have access to Switch just to enter the game and to check it all. So in this case, they will just check the screenshots and they will make a report according to them. The process usually takes several hours depending on how big the game is. And by the end of this work that the localizer does, the developer gets a report of all the issues and bugs which they have come across. So this could be the issues connected to the context. So in this case, we can just make the amendment of the translation on the localization platform, and we will send the developer an updated file with the updated translation. So this is actually the easiest thing to fix. Then go some technical problems like the strings which are too long. And in this case, it depends on the developer. We can shorten the string, shorten the text, or if they have some capacity to expand a window for text in another language, they can do it on their side. And by the end of this process, the developer gets the report and the updated localization set with all the strings updated, which could be updated on our side. And then they fix the rest. If they have anything to fix on their side, they do that. We can also discuss some string length limits which should be applied to the buttons, for example, or to some strings which need to be more compact.
Okay. So, one question that I have, and this is something we brought up on our notes, I'm sure, again, this is another thing that developers don't really think about, is the importance of localization testing. Like, what happens if developers don't do this step? And are there any, like, major, like, noticeable tells that you can see, like, if you're playing a game that you know the developer either missed a step or they didn't really complete it all the way?
So the most obvious, I think, is when the strings don't match the interface of the game. So when you can't really read what the button contains, or you can't really read the string till it's sent, you can see the end of the string of the sentence just because it ends somewhere outside the screen. So this is, I would say, the most obvious thing that can show you that there was no localization testing, because during the testing, these things are really the most visible of all. The next thing is the context mismatch. This is a bit more difficult to see when you do the localization testing, but if the localization testing is done accurately, the testers will spot such mismatches. So it can be, buttons mismatch or some repeating or similar translations of the buttons which mean different things. Sometimes it happens. For example, you have window which suggests you to go back to some location or to go back to some stage in the game. It can be that during the localization process, without knowing the exact context, the verbs were translated in the same way. And you have the window where you have two buttons and they have just the same wording on them. And you just don't know what to choose because they are really the same. And this is really what makes the players angry, as far as I know. It is not only about the games, you can see it everywhere in IT products development. But localization testing really what helps you to solve this.
One thing that I've been seeing in some games, I want to know, I'm curious if this is also part of localization testing, is that for games that feature subtitles of what characters are saying, that the subtitle of what is being shown is not what somebody is saying. Like example could be the subtitle could be I am going out for dinner, and then the voice acting is I'm going out with a group of friends. Would that be an example of something that would have been caught in localization testing?
I suppose that this can be caught in localization testing if the voiceover is already set up when the localization testing is in process, because without the translated voiceover, you can't really see this, you can hear this differences. The localizers usually check if the subtitles correspond to the source text. For example, if the characters are speaking in English and you have the subtitles in some target language, in some other language, so it can be checked. But for the voiceover, you need to have it already implemented in the game to spot this. I know that it usually happens not only in games, but also in just localization of video content. Even if you like watch series, you can spot this difference sometimes. Yes, but it is because the dubbing really requires a bit different approach than the subtitling. And when we do subtitles for the games, we have a bit more freedom of what words we can use and how long the subtitles can be compared to the dubbing, where the translation should also meet some other specific requirements, like how the characters talk, how they move when they talk, and the rest. So that is why the dubbing text and the subtitling text can be a bit different.
All right. So we've spent some time talking about localization testing, and I'm sure there is certainly a lot more we could spend some time on. But in terms of, I guess, a little bit more about like your role as a localization manager, anything else like either unique or specific about what you do on a case by case basis that we haven't touched on yet that you would like to expand on?
Well, I would say that the localization manager is a person who really becomes a member of your team as a developer. I would say in some projects where we work on continuous localization, where we localize every update on yearly, monthly basis with some customers who have really strong relationship in this regard. So when you do these updates and do the continuous localization, you really become so involved in the project that you can spot some errors, some mistakes, even on the stage when the localizers are just doing the translation and the proofreaders are doing the proofreading. The localization manager can be so knowledgeable of different aspects of the project that they can spot some things even before they came to the developer's attention. So I think this is really what is unique about localization managers in the localization companies. They have the strong connection both to the localization world and to the customers world. We really play the games that we localize and we spend some time on them. And even after the localization process has been finished, sometimes when you are playing in your native language, for example, you can have some ideas of how to improve the localization next time. So this is also how we can influence the process. So it is not just mechanical communication role that you're connecting the developer to the localization team, but you're a part of this team. And as a part of this team, you also influence the process.
So, speaking about the process, we talked earlier about kind of the differences between, a smaller game versus like a massive RPG. In terms of localization, is there like a minimum amount of time that it takes to do a process like this? Like, let's say on a smaller game, and what would be kind of like, I guess, quote unquote, a lengthier localization process? Like, how long does like something longer take?
Well, it depends on how much we have to localize. For smaller games, I would say sometimes just a week or two can be enough. So if we're just localizing in just several languages or just in one language, sometimes the developers start with localizing from their native language to English, for example, just to have some international coverage and then to think about localizing next into some markets. And on a smaller game, we can spend like a week or two. For bigger games, it can really take months So we can localize in batches, like one by one, and it can take up to like 6 months, for example, if the game is really big. But I would say that usually, even for big games, the process is more or less finished in 1 to 3 months.
Okay.
So if to include localization testing, it may take a bit more time, but still. So the amount of time you spend in localization really depends on the amount of text in the game, on the amount of gameplay, because we also need to check lots of things when we are localizing, and it also takes time just to go through some gameplay features. And also on the amount of languages. Some languages are a bit more difficult to localize in than others, just because it takes more time to assemble a team of translators and proofreaders.
All right. And yeah, again, it's definitely a very interesting topic, and as we've said throughout this cast, like, in terms of how much the game industry has become globalized, it is certainly something that developers need to consider. I've spoken to developers internationally, especially the last year, and one of the things that kind of stood out to me about those conversations is this idea that you really can't think about video games locally anymore. That if I am in, a European country, that I just want to release my game to the European market and not think about anyone else. And as you said earlier about, how certain aspects of localization, if it doesn't work, can really annoy players, it really kind of drives home the point of accessibility and approachability that people want in today's market. That if somebody is buying your game, they want to understand, or they literally want to be able to understand what's being said and read in that title.
Well, I suppose that the necessity to understand the game is connected, not connected, but is intervened with the wish to explore something new. So you're right that the games are not really local anymore, and there are more and more requests of localization, which prove that. And also the languages actually that are now the most popular for localization also prove that, because one of them is Portuguese Brazilian, for example. And Chinese Simplified is also in top 5 languages that are most used for localization. So I would say that no one is just focused on their own market. People are looking outside their own market. And in this case, it is really important that the player understands the game, yes, and has an opportunity to play it in their own language or in some international language. But also, I think that if the game is European, it would be, I guess, interesting for players from other markets to see the specifics of the country where it was developed. So I would say that localization shouldn't kill this specific regional aspects of the game. It should be our way to like explore different cultures and different sets of mind. And it is really an important balance for those who localize the games, how you keep this interest in the other cultures and how you make the game understandable and exciting for the players in your own market. So this is a balance that should be kept.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you brought up translating into Brazilian. I've spoken, especially the last few months for people listening to us, several developers from studios in Brazil, and how Brazil is really trying to position itself as kind of like the next big video game country in terms of supporting indie developers and trying to build studios there. And speaking to one of those developers is exactly aware of this conversation about thinking about your games globally, not locally, came from. Because for people listening to us, like, I've been playing indie games from the international market for now about a decade. And there is a very noticeable difference between games that came from other cultures back in 2011, 2012 to where we're seeing them now. That a lot of those earlier games focus very much on the local culture and not really doing much to try to expand on that. And then what we're seeing today is that even though games may be influenced or referencing local or cultural elements, that they are really trying to make their games as widely reaching as possible. And then again, this drives home this point that you need to think about not just the local market these days, especially if you're trying to build a studio.
Well, I totally agree that this is a feature of today's games, and the more we see in localization, the more I'm convinced that every developer, even a small developer just starting a game, they all think about going international at some point or another. Last year showed us that it is really important to be prepared to come to the international market where the demand to your game can be even higher than at your local market. So because people are getting more and more involved in each other cultures, I would say, and it is sometimes more interesting to explore someone's cultural background than of, for example, your own region. But at the same time, as you said, it is interesting to explore, but it is also necessary for the game to be understandable. So that is why the developers are using the approach that they're trying to add something local to their games, but to make them more internationally understandable. And as the culture in general becomes more and more internationalized with the streaming content which every country shares, and with the trends growing in different platforms, we can use these international references in our local products just to make them more understandable and more captivating for people in very different markets.
All right, so with that, I think we just have a few more questions on our notes, and then we'll start to wrap things up. So, one thing that we haven't really talked about during our cast is the pricing for localization. And I was hoping you could expand a little bit on that. What would be, on the cheaper side, what is very expensive, and, elements along those lines.
So, as I said, there are three groups of rates, and rates are based on. So, we have a word rate and a rate for 1,000 characters with spaces. We actually use the rate of 1,000 characters with spaces because we have different languages. Some of them are hieroglyphic languages, and so where you don't really have words as we're used to them. So that is why for these languages, we need some fair way to count the real amount of work for localizers. And that is why we're using these two kinds of rates. So it is for characters with spaces and for words. And on cheaper side, we would have the most popular languages, the most localizable languages across the world. So these are usually the European languages. So in the middle rate group, we would have the Asian languages and also the European languages, which are less common, like, for example, Dutch. Then we have the highest rate group, which is Scandinavian and Japanese. So this is actually what determines the costs of localization, the amount of text you have and the languages you pick. So this is what determines the costs. This is, I mean, for localization, so for translation and for proofreading. For localization testing, the determining element is the amount of time that the localizers will need to spend in your game to check everything. So if the gameplay is really simple, it will be not too much. If it is more complicated with many locations to visit, with many buttons to push, this will take more time and thus it will cost more.
Okay. I guess with deciding which languages fall in the low tier and which ones fall into the higher tier, is it besides just how much a language is used or how much it's kind of the market for it, or does the complexity of the language also factor in?
I would say the most important is not the complexity of the language, but the number of localizers on the market, on the localization market for this specific language. There are really rare languages for which there are not too much localizers there, and it is sometimes really hard to find a person who specializes in, for example, game localization and who is a native speaker of some rare language. So for these languages, the costs will be usually higher. For the languages where we have lots of translators and proofreaders and lots of specialists on the market, the pricing will be a bit lower. So I would say that not the complexity or some specifics of the language decisive, but the localization market, the market of translators and proofreaders. So their amount and their specializations are what is important.
Okay. And I guess another point about this for developers who want to get their game localized, but especially for smaller developers who don't necessarily have a huge budget for this kind of stuff, any tips or any suggestions you can give them in terms of getting the most bang for their buck?
Well, I would say that it will also depend on the game a bit. So
Mm-hmm.
you first need to choose the market. So for which market it is suited best. Because sometimes the localization for a completely different market with a completely different cultural features, it can be a bit more complicated and it can take more time. Not necessarily more money, but more time, and you will need to make more adjustments on your side as the developer in the gameplay, for example. This can also take your time and your budget. So that is why I would first look at the market, and then I would choose languages that cover most of your possible audience. So I would go from the audience. But in general, again, the most popular options are European languages like Spanish, French, and also Chinese. When you're choosing between Chinese simplified and Chinese traditional,
Mm-hmm.
Chinese simplified is usually preferred just because it is spoken by more people. But with the Chinese traditional, we can also gain some important part of the market. And when you're choosing languages, it is important to remember that the popular languages also create some more competition. So when you come to the international market, to some region, if this is a popular region for localization, you will have more competitors in this region, obviously. So sometimes you can want to be kind of creating and thinking out of the box and just choosing some other regions where your game doesn't have so much competitors yet. For example, now the rising stars of the localization markets are Hindi and Korean. So these are the languages that are gaining weight now. So they're considered like to be in the second wave of localization at least, and sometimes in the first, because the market's not yet so full of competitors,
Mm-hmm.
and you can really promote your game there very well.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, I heard Korean. What was the other language that's gained more popularity?
Hindi and Korean.
Hindi. Okay, got it. Man, and that's very interesting. Again, as we're seeing more globalization when it comes to game development, as we've said throughout this cast, that countries that really didn't have a game dev space are really trying to build one these days. And that's definitely a conversation or a greater conversation for another time, I'm sure. Are there any other, I guess, major trends in the world of localization that developers should be keeping an eye on?
Well, for localization, I think it's very useful to keep an eye on the games and apps which are downloaded and played in specific regions. So I think this is obvious for those who are developing games who are preparing for localization, that they look through the lists of the countries where the products are downloaded and bought more often than in others. This could be also a way to choose a language for
Mm-hmm.
localization. But I think it's also worth to see not only the downloads number or the revenue number, which is also important when choosing the market, but also to see, as you said, how the local markets are developing in the regions where you want to come. So I would say these are the three things you should keep in mind when you are choosing market for localization: is downloads, revenue, and the development of local industries.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I think with that, to begin to wrap things up for this cast, and this has only been a very fascinating conversation, Yana. Thank you again for coming on.
Thanks a lot for inviting me. It was great to have a chat with you.
Yep, not a problem. So, I guess for our notes here, like for our final point, does Alchonos work with developers, I guess, post release on whether or not like games have to be updated, materials have to be updated, or even again like when it comes to community management, making sure that if the developer wants to announce a major news piece for their game, that it gets properly translated and localized to like all the respective countries and territories that it's in.
Sure, we're actually very eager to keep our
Mm-hmm.
partnership with the developers after the localization. The big part of the localization is finished, and it can be either they come with the updates, and sometimes the updates are continuous, and then we come to the continuous localization, which is the localization process, which takes place like every week or every 2 weeks or every month. It depends on how often the developer updates the game.
Mm-hmm.
They can just come with some major marketing updates, as you said, with some big announcements and this and such. So we can localize it too. So it is good that we know the context and we know the best way of how to translate such things. Also, another way to communicate with the developers after the localization is just to localize into new languages. So this is also can be a way to keep our communication with them. When we finish the first wave, like the first group of languages, and it works properly, the customers just come to us with requests for some other regions and for other groups.
All right. And I guess to wrap things up, I guess two questions to kind of wrap up our cast on. First, anything else regarding the localization process, whether it's something that Alchonos does, something as your role as a localization manager, anything that we didn't touch on that you would like to talk about?
Well, we just touched a bit on the continuous localization, and I think this is a really great feature that we provide for constant updates,
Mm-hmm.
if not of the game itself or of the game content, but of some marketing materials. So something around the game, something, for example, for the social networks
Mm-hmm.
and such. So this is what we actually like to do just because we really know what we're localizing. After localizing the game, the continuous localization is arranged a bit different than just the localization process. It may actually involve even some deeper integration on technical level. So sometimes the developers find a way to integrate our localization platform into their system so that they just can drop us some new streams and we automatically start localizing. And then they can have the streams ready without actually even too much interaction, too much communication with the localization manager. So
Mm-hmm.
this is one of the features that I think is useful for the developers and it's good for us because we can set up this process really well.
Mm-hmm. When you do a continuous localization like this, do you set up like a number of projects or like a number like a duration? Like you'll work with a developer 6 months after release, 1 year, so on and so forth.
It depends on the developer. So as soon as they come, we can use the project that we used for localization in the past. So we just bring it up and just add languages or just add new streams. So it depends on what the developer has. And so it only depends on the developer of how often we communicate. So it can be once in 2 or 3 months for some projects, and for some projects it can be really every week. And we have like twice a week we can have some new streams to translate. So it can be both ways.
Okay. And I guess the final question before we do our wrap up, anything like funny or unique that came up with localization that maybe would be a good story for a developer to listen to.
Well, for the funny stories, well, all the funny stories are really connected to some challenges that we actually came across. So for me, I guess the recent, not too recent, but a story which I can remember just now is localization of a small game. where I needed to draw some characters and to make some pictures. So it was about drawing. It was actually a Christmas update, so we had added some new characters in there. So it had some Christmas deer, and at some point the developer started to think about if the deer actually were male or female and what names we should give to each of them in each language. So, and how they should look, and what colors we should use on them depending on the gender. And so we actually discuss every deer in the Santa Claus deer family. So we looked up the background, and for each language we actually chose some specific names, specific features of how they look and how they're named and how they communicate depending on the background that we found. So that was a kind of a crazy Christmas update. This was really the case when the developer was so deep into the game that he thought about literally everything, every little detail. And it is really fascinating. And when we are working with people like that, so you also get engaged too, and you spend really, even as a localization manager, you spend lots of time just investigating the game, investigating some characters in it, just to make it right, to make it look right and feel right in every language that you're localizing in.
I have to imagine, for games that have, you can choose, random names for characters, or it has, a pool of names that you can choose from, that it's gotta get very crazy from a localization standpoint. Like, if the developer says, let's just have, 100 names that could possibly show up, and, just keep adding them for, every single character, every single element in it.
Well, actually, we had such a situation not so long ago. We were localizing a game where there was really a huge number of names for dogs.
Mm-hmm.
So both male and female, and some neutral names too. And some names were really neutral, so they could be both male and female dogs could use them.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, there were like Alexander and Alexandra,
Mm-hmm.
something like that, and Alejandro, for example, which could be used in both languages. And it was English, so this was the English source which had them. So, and when we localized into Spanish, we needed to make sure that in Spanish, this difference will be also noted somehow. So this was kind of a bit of a challenge, and there were really lots of names. So we spent also some time by just making sure that they don't repeat and that they reflect the gender features that they should reflect.
Okay. All right. So I think with that, any final point any you would like to say about localization to end the cast on?
I would like to say that localization is inevitable, maybe. In my opinion, every developer comes to it, and you shouldn't be afraid to start going on with localization. So, with agencies like Alchonos, we will just guide you through every step. And by the end of this process, you will be willing to go to the next stage and to expand and to make something more than already is done. This is a great way to expand your game not only on your market but in the rest of the world, which is so internationalized now that it is hard to imagine how we can do without localization.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So, with that, I think we'll wrap up our discussion for tonight. Yana, again, it's been a pleasure chatting with you about this topic. If you have any social media, any, plugs you want to make, feel free.
Thanks a lot for inviting me again. It was a pleasure to talk about the localization and everything around it.
Okay. So, I think with that, we'll end things for this week's cast. For those of you who are still with us, thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to do the liking and subscribing if you're watching this on YouTube channel. If you are a developer working on an upcoming project or just want to talk game design with me, we're always happy to have new guests. Feel free to send me a message and get in touch. Check out our Discord and Patreon, and be sure to look at my latest books, including Game Design Deep Dive Horror, that is just released. Come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Until next time, take care.